So first of all, thank you, Gary, for this invitation. So I'm here representing my colleagues with who you have organized 2 weeks ago at the Semantics conference, the workshop that was called Ontologies for Fair and Fair Ontologies. And then I will give you an overview of the topic and then discuss some outcomes of the workshop that have been taken, so as I said, in the semantics in the last 2 weeks. So you can go for the next slide, please. So the agenda of this presentation, I will just introduce a little bit the topic and go in 2 main aspects, on 2 main dimensions. The first dimension on ontologies for fair, and the second dimension, producing fair ontologies, so producing ontologies that are themselves fair, and some words on the outcomes of the workshops and some outcomes also of our discussions. To go to an introduction in the topic. So as you have already, Gary has introduced it in his talk today. You have to make data available and usable. So making data produced by different scientific researchers from data stewards and for many service providers that have been producing a number of data sets and a number of incredible number of data. You need to make them reusable and understandable. And in order to make this data understandable and reusable, first of all understandable in order to be reusable, so these fair principles can help on that. And so these principles findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability can help on guiding the data providers in order to publish it and make this data interoperable and reusable. The focus here in the talk about ontologies is on interoperability. So you just go to make a focus on interoperability, as Gary has at the end of his presentation mentioned as well. So for us, this was also the focus of our workshop. It is how ontologies can help on interoperability and how ontologies can be themselves interoperable, can be themselves fair. When we look in more precisely on the interoperability principle, you can take the words from Lulison that have defined these principles and have a look on these 3 principles. The first one is that in order to be interoperable, data and semantic resources in general have to use a formal, accessible, shared language for knowledge representation. The second one is that this data or metadata has to be described using vocabularies that themselves follow the FAIR principles, and these data and metadata have to include references to other metadata. So taking these 3 principles into account, you have already, it was discussing the whole of ontologies on these 3 principles for interoperability. You can go for the next slide, please. And then, as Giancarlo Guisardo, that has also participated as co-organizer of the workshop, has stated out in his paper on data intelligence 2 years ago, and what you from the ontology community has also, this is a kind of affirmation that you can follow, is that ontologies play a central role in interoperability when following the FAIR principles, because they are able to capture the conceptualizations, the semantics behind the descriptions, and can then describe, richly describe the digital resources in order to articulate the representation. So ontologies can be used in order to finally describe the semantics of the descriptions of these objects that are being described, the data that are being described. So you can go for the next slide. So having said that, so that you focus on interoperability and the role of ontologies in interoperability of the FAIR principles, as I just introduced it before, you focus in 2 dimensions: ontologies that can be used for improving interoperability, and also ontologies that are themselves FAIR. So in fact, the FAIR principles have been defined in a recursive manner. It means that they use ontologies for describing their sources and for making resources interoperable, but ontologies are also interoperable. So this is the 2 dimensions that you have been so far discussing in our workshop. So first, in order for data to be interoperable, it should be described using semantic resources that are themselves interoperable. So in other words, in order to be FAIR, data and metadata must be described using resources that are themselves FAIR. And then I go a little bit further on each dimension. So first of all, ontologies for FAIR. In fact, you could observe, and then this as well has been already stated in many works and many recommendations in the FAIR principles, that many of the recommendations are based on metadata. So you need to describe data with metadata, with rich metadata. But what is rich metadata? So it's also a discussion that can take longer. So most of the FAIR recommendations, in fact, rely or refer to metadata. And as I just mentioned before, in order to have rich metadata in the sense of how you can describe the semantics behind what you are describing, how you can provide a conceptual formalization and a conceptual representation of this data and that you are representing, you need to have rich descriptions. And also one point here, in order to make data interoperable, so you have to have ontologies, but also it's not enough to have ontologies that are limited to describing the descriptive metadata, as for example, author, provenance, etc., but also it's one thing that you have also discussed in our workshop, is that you need to have domain-specific descriptions, and you need to have also domain-specific ontologies in order to make data and the data sets in general interoperable, and also to provide the reusability. Because if you do not understand the data, you cannot reuse them. So this is one point. And then just for review a little bit, the different ontologies that can be used. Just you can go for the next slide, please. You have several. So when you talk about ontologies for describing data, you have several different ontologies that can be used for describing data at different levels of metadata, descriptional, quality, provenance, etc. So you have vocabularies that are not that much expressive, but have to be mentioned because they are really used. For example, you have vocabularies for describing metadata in general, as for example, Dublin Core, GCAT, that is really used in a range of metadata for describing data, DCAT, AP, and other also extensions of DCAT, but they are used for describing, as I said, descriptive metadata, curator, etc. You have also that I didn't mention in my slides, but provenance, prov-u, that is also a vocabulary that has been used for describing the provenance of the data. We have also vocabularies and ontologies that have been used for describing data sets with specific features, as for example, multidimensional data for the RDF data cube that has been used for describing the dimensions, measures, and properties of a specific data set. You have SOSA, for example, for describing observations that have been used for describing any kind of observation from satellite images to weather sensors and etc. You have GeoSparkle as well for describing geospatial information and so on. And you have specific domain-specific ontologies, and you need domain-specific ontologies. I just given here an example among many others, but for example, the social science and humanities set of metadata that have been proposed so far from the EOSC. Next slide, just to give an example that what you have been doing so far in your team, just to provide an idea on how ontologies can help on improve fairness of data. You have been working on several meteorological data sets. These meteorological data are very, very important in several applications. And what you could observe here is that different researchers, when they are looking for meteorological data, they are difficulties for understanding the data. And these data are available in several different portals. As in France, you have several, you have an official entity that provides this data that is called Meteo France. But this data can be also obtained in different portals with different descriptions, etc. And they provide a variety of measurements and so on. But as I said, you have been working with people that work on some how the pollution can impact in the health, and they need to use different meteorological data. They are really you could not find the right data in the mass of available data. And then if you go to the next slide, for example, just to give an example of data that is available, that is provided by Meteo France. This data is described with insufficiency of details. Just for example, it's a PDF. They provide a PDF of all the measures, and you have, for example, 2 columns that I just mentioned in my slides, T, but you cannot see. Even if you go for the documentation, you cannot see if T is the temperature of the air or ground temperature. P and R as well, it's another column, but we don't know. And if you go for the description, they are described with not enough information. Then you have been working with this official data provider in France in order to improve interoperability, in order to improve the description of this data using ontologies and domain-specific ontologies. So you can go for the next slide, please. And then you have been working on the process of verification, this data. So I am not going to detail all the steps here, but to give an idea of the methodology and the process that have been so far applied. You have identified the purpose of data verification, and for us it was exposing the data in a way that data consumers can understand the data. You have analyzed the data with the data providers and also with a small group of data consumers. You have analyzed the metadata, and what you are being working so far until now is to work in defining the semantic model for describing this data and for describing the metadata. So this is what you have been working. I just presented a little bit what you have done in the steps 4A and 4B, as in the next slide, please. So you have combined, you have reused different vocabularies that I'm not going to detail here, but I will be glad to answer, to discuss with you offline or after the presentation. So you have reused, you have identified the features of this data. So these data are geolocalized, so you needed to geocat for describing them. This is a tabular data, so you have to have a CSVWA for describing the structure of the CSV file. This data can be seen as a multidimensional data, so you can have dimensions for analyzing this data, and you can have then combined to the main ontologies in order to describe the sense of each concept. For example, on temperature, what is the temperature? The air temperature, is the ground temperature, and etc. So this is just an overview of the vocabulary that you have been proposed so far, combining reused and fair vocabularies. Then next, you have an example of the instantiation. If you can go in the next slide, please. You have an example of the instantiation. So for example, here, you can see that the PMER is one of the column. This is the sea level pressure. You have describing with the unity measure, and you linked more. Very important here is not only the definition that you have added, but you have also linked this concept to an existing suite ontology, and then the user can go further to this ontology in order to obtain more rich information, and this for each concept of the domain, and then allows for better interoperability. So you have analyzed this data without the ontologies and with the ontologies, and we have evaluated how users can understand this data without and with the semantic annotation. And then in the next slide, you can have some information on the evaluation of the sharedness, and then you can see here that we improve interoperability. So you have a user here. You have a report in the references. You can access the detailed report on this evaluation. You have a user, the RGA model for evaluating the sharedness, and then you can observe that with the users can much better understand the data, and then can be more, he used more this data as well. So just go for the next slide, please. And then the second dimension that I would like to mention is that the ontologies that you use for describing this data have to be themselves fair. You have many recommendations for providing and guiding ontologies for publishing fair ontologies on the web. So you have many proposals that have been discussed in the literature. So you mentioned 3 of them. So I choose 3 of them, but you have different ones. But I think these 3 are the most recent ones, and that the first one, you can go to the next slide, is the Simon Cox proposal. I'm sorry, it's not very good, the resolution of the image, but this paper of Simon Cox has presented 10 sample rules in order to make ontologies fair. So the vocabulary is denoted by a persistent identifier. So the ontology is published and has a unique identifier. The vocabulary is dereferenceable, so you can access this vocabulary and have a machine human also visualization in HTML, for example. This vocabulary or ontology conforms to standards used in the domain. You have clear information on the license, on the usage, and you have enough information on the user to understand each term. So I refer to this paper. This is a very nice paper that describes the 10 sample rules for making ontologies fair. You have also some automatic tools that have been appeared so far for evaluating the degree of fairness of ontologies. One is FOHTI, that I put the link here, that runs 24 different checks on how the ontologies fits to the FAIR principles. So you can run an example and you can put the rewrite of your ontology, and then you check in terms of findability, reusability, accessibility, etc., that you provide different analysis. And is a nice tool for being used for evaluating and improving, because for these 24 checks, they detail each check, and then can be used for evaluating the fairness of the ontology, and then he gives a score representing how the level of fairness of your resource, your ontology. This is focused on ontology, sorry. Next one is the Agro portal tool. So this is the reference. So if you have your ontologies in Agro portal, this is also a set of a tool that can be used for evaluating. So they are based on a set of informations, 61 questions that are automatically and semi-automatically indicated. And then again, I come back again with the fact that still you have many information on the evaluation is highly depends on the metadata. So you have a nice visualization for each one of the 61 criteria. They give an explanation on how you can improve the fairness of your ontology. Next one, please. So I mean, just giving a very brief overview, and then some things that you have discussed in the workshop, and I would be glad to discuss with you as well. You have many recommendations, many tools that have been appeared so far for evaluating the fairness of semantic resources in general, including ontologies. But what you could observe is that you have different tools that you score differently according to the criteria they use. It's still missing alignment between these different guidelines, and alignment between these different recommendations in order to arrive with a basic guideline for helping users in order to make this data and the data sets and semantic resources in general fair. One point that I have also discussed is how much ontologies have been reused, because so you should describe data if ontologies that they're themselves fair, but you could observe, you have some papers that report that ontologies are not that much reusable, and why they are not fully reusable, how so the FAIR principles could help on that. Another point that you mentioned is also how you can refine the FAIR principles in order to also address reproducibility. This is one point, so you have new vocabularies as well for better addressing reproducibility. In general, how the FAIR principles can impact the ontology development, and another point is also how to deal with the evolution of the resources, because the resources evolve, and then how you can also involve in metadata and etc. So this is all. I hope you can have a nice discussion here as well. So thank you so much. I don't know if I'm on time or for you.
Oh, don't worry about time.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Yeah, we have open discussion later.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So for me, it's all. So you have time for discussion.
Yes, we have. Do you have questions? We have 5 to 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, great.
So for the online participant, if you have questions, please raise your hands. Oh, we have one question here.
On the chat, I can read the chat?
No, we have a question on site.
On site question, okay.
Hello, this is Joshua. I put my question in the chat, so I'll just read it. But So when scoring ontologies, how do you quantify the accessibility and reusability of the ontology for non-ontologies? So in other words, if the general research population can't understand an ontology, its connections and its structures, does that affect its fair score?
Yeah. How you can, so the question is how you can, let me check how you can quantify the accessibility. Donc, accessibility is, you can, for example, with FOHTs, you can see if the metadata can be retrieved using standardized vocabularies, if the metadata are accessible, even if the resource is not accessible. They also evaluate if the protocol that you use in order to provide the metadata is open. So this is that examples of checks in terms of accessibility. It's most relies on the accessibility of the metadata.
But that, I mean, from my understanding, that's more accessibility as in being able to get it, and maybe a little bit of understanding each particulate, but not necessarily understanding the ontology as a whole, or you know, the local neighborhood of the term. You know, I work with a lot of bench top, you know, researchers, and they get very confused with ontologies. And when you create portals and tools for them to enter data and use ontological terms, they almost always pick the wrong one because they don't pick the best term. They the most specific. They'll pick a higher general term because they don't understand the ontologies and how they're connected. That, you know, they could really be choosing, you know, this term as opposed to a very high level term.
Oh,
and to me, you know, that gets to the you know, usability of the ontology for people who didn't design and fully understand ontology.
This is Gary. I might make one or two comments on it. Does involve the idea of trust. For me, one of the things is the visualization of the relationships is helpful. It shows a neighborhood, and one can read the relations between items. So that's important for a user who's not semantically experienced. And the other thing is within a tool, you can see not only the definition, but you see things that are meant, which is axiomatized for systems, but for a human user, you see additional metadata such as notes and annotations that can be read. So in case the ontology was designed around a particular use case, that might be documented, that can help. So it comes back to both visualization to help understanding and also documentation for users.
Yeah, so everybody who speaks, please turn on your camera if possible and speak your institution and then name. Thank you. Who else? Questions?
Yeah, just to comment on what Gary just add. I totally agree that is very, very important in order to make ontologies understandable, is that they need to be visualized in a human readable way. For example, using a nice documentation and documenting or presenting a nice visualization, because in order to be reusable, they need to be firstly interoperable. So you need to understand the concepts and the relations in these ontologies in order to reuse. This is what you do, when you are constructing ontologies by reusing. So you need to understand these ontologies before reusing them. So in order to, it's very, very important to have enough terminological layer, a rich terminological layer that the humans can also understand.
Okay. We have another question. We have another question on site.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is John Beverly. I'm gonna push back a little more on that spot there to pick up on Justin. So that's an awful lot of input. That's an awful lot to put on the users, I think, to have them understand, graphs and axioms. I mean, we get it, right? But we do this for a living. They don't. And is the point here to like teach them how? Is that what we're doing? Like teach them how to use it as they're using it? I just don't think that's going to scale. And I don't think it's a good way forward. Is there? So take this as a question. Are there other options you can rely, or other ways you can address Jackson's concern? Because I think the ones you've raised here, or the options you've posed here, just don't think are going to work.
Yeah, can you repeat? This is cutting a lot the connection.
Oh, yeah. So he's adding to Joshua's question that he's saying if we are talking about what we're talking about here give a lot of pressure to the end users who is not So I think we are more addressing the ontology development people instead of end user. Is my understanding correct?
Yes. It's what you did in this project with the end user is that you have many meetings in order to explain them what an ontology is and the resultant ontologies and also visualization. So in fact, they have been formed in somehow to the concept of ontologies, and how they are used for organizing the knowledge and how they can be used for reasoning and so on. So in fact, it is still, you needed to pay attention on how you represent the information to end users. And I think this is a very good point, and I have no answers for that. But it's really, really an important point. You cannot see only from the point of view of ontology construction and the ontologists, but also think on having the view of the ontology and the data consumers.
So this is Gary. If there's time for one more comment, I tend to think of these things on ontologies analogous to data modeling. So in the data modeling realm, before we develop the relational data model, or whatever the particular final form is, we should develop a conceptual model. So the conceptual model is more understandable. You don't have to know a lot about databases to understand the conceptual model. And the same thing sort of to me applies to ontologies. There should be a version that essentially is more understandable to humans, but then aligns with the formalization in there, so that the two essentially one supports the other.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question on site.
No, that's not a question. I want to add to answering the question. I'm Matthias Trojahn from UAMS. So we have, I think not every end user is the same, and I clearly hear you. I'm working with clinical partners. They don't have the time, and I hope they don't have the time. They should be busy saving lives to teach them this is an ontology, this is how it works. So mostly the ontology remains in a black box, and we have then some people we work closer with, and they understand why we have the ontology for the drug. We had really good experience in adding documentation to the out file, like annotations, that then get displayed in the tools that the clinicians do, that are not like ontological definitions, that are explanations, and we verify those explanations with the members of that community. So I think it's really important. There are very different levels of end users. Also, in the initial question, I didn't like the idea that there is one community of researchers and they all understand everything except ontologies. I mean, I work with cancer with people. I have no clue about cancer now. I'm serious. So, and they don't need to have not all of them need to fully understand what I do. We need to provide tooling, and we need to provide the documentation to help them understand for their task. This is also task driven, for their task, enough of what's going on. 100% agree.
Great. We can move to the next speaker. Thank you so much, Cassia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you all for these nice discussions. Thank you.